Hello and welcome to Analysis with me, John Rees. Ex-Prime Minister Tony Blair's attempted political comeback took to the road again last week with a major speech in London. Still in his role as Middle East peace envoy, Blair argued that the conflict in the Middle East and growing Islamic extremism are the biggest threats to world peace. Let's take a look at some of that speech.
Thank you. The Middle East matters. What is presently happening there still represents, in my view, the biggest threat to global security of the early 21st century. The region, including the wider area outside its conventional boundary, Pakistan, Afghanistan to the east, North Africa to the west, is in turmoil, with no end in sight and any number of potential outcomes from the mildly optimistic to the catastrophic. At the root of the crisis lies a radicalized and politicized view of Islam, an ideology that distorts and warps Islam's true message. The threat of this radicalized Islam is not abating, it is growing, it is spreading across the world, it is destabilizing communities and even nations, it is undermining the possibility of peaceful coexistence in an era of globalization. And yet, in the face of this threat, we seem curiously reluctant to acknowledge it and powerless to counter it effectively. For the last 40, 50 years, there has been a steady stream of funding, proselytizing, organizing, and promulgating coming out of the Middle East, pushing views of religion that are narrow-minded and dangerous. Unfortunately, we seem blind to the enormous global impact such teaching has had and is having. Within the Middle East itself, the result has been horrible, with people often facing a choice between authoritarian government that is at least religiously tolerant and the risk that in throwing off the government you don't like, you end up with the religiously intolerant quasi-theocracy. There is not a region of the world not adversely affected by Islamism, and the ideology is growing. The problems of the Middle East and North Africa are obvious. But look at the terror being inflicted in countries: Nigeria, Mali, Central African Republic, Chad, and many others, across sub-Saharan Africa. Indeed, I would argue that right now, religious extremism is probably the single biggest threat to their ability long-term to overcome the massive challenges of development.
Thank you so much. Absolutely excellent.
Well, the speech also insisted that the West should have launched an attack on Syria and advocated support for Field Marshal el-Sisi's military-backed regime in Egypt. The speech was not universally applauded. In the Independent newspaper, veteran political commentator Patrick Cockburn described it as demented. Even fellow neoconservative thinkers who agree with Blair's message were questioning whether he was the person best placed to deliver it. So, is Blair simply saying what the other Western leaders think but can't say? Or is he a voice in the wilderness? Should we be concerned with what he has to say anymore? Joining me in the studio today to discuss the issues are Azam Tamimi, Director of the Institute of Islamic Political Thought in London, Chris Nynham, who's National Officer of the Stop the War Coalition, and Chris Doyle, Director of the Council for Arab-British Understanding. Welcome to you all. Dr. Tamimi, do you think that we should be concerned anymore with Blair, or do you think he's an isolated figure?
Well, since he stepped down as Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, he's been working as a messenger boy, once for the Americans. It started actually with the Americans, for the Saudis, the Emiratis, and now the coup authorities in Egypt. So most probably this is a message he's been asked to convey.
Chris, do you think that's true, that there's a sort of, I guess what Dr. Tamimi is saying is that there is actually a wider constituency that he's representing here, that he's not simply an isolated voice?
He's not an isolated voice, but I think he actually believes it. I don't think it's just because there are friendly governments who might echo those views. I think he is a believer. And what we've heard in this speech, much of this we've heard before, but there are a few extra ingredients that have attracted a great deal of criticism. And it's noticeable just how much criticism that he got. This idea that you can ally yourself with dictatorial regimes to fight Islamic extremism seems, I think, to most people a complete nonsense, that actually these dictatorial regimes, whether in Egypt or Russia, have been part of the problem, and that the idea that they can be part of the solution seems absurd. The other thing that he is doing now is trying, as ever, to justify what went on in Iraq by saying that if 2003 had not happened, Iraq would look like Syria today. Now, that is an extremely tenuous argument. In fact, au contraire, you could argue that because of what has happened in Iraq and the sectarianism in Iraq and the extremism that was in Iraq, it actually has made the issue of Syria today worse, because you've got all these fighters crossing borders, people expert in explosives, and the extremism that has blighted that area. So there is Tony Blair. He is still listened to. He still gets a lot of media exposure. I think he gets a lot of support within the United States, but actually within Britain, I'd have to say that most of the newspapers, the Daily Mail included, were very, very critical.
Mm. I mean, Chris, that was one of the glaring fault lines in the speech, wasn't it? The supposedly all this is framed in sort of democratic language and support for Democrats, but on the other hand, the coup in Egypt was absolutely fine. There's absolutely no mention of the Saudis in all this.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, I think there's two things going on in the speech which kind of overlap. One is self-justification. I mean, Chilcot may happen. It seems to have been buried, but, you know, we've got to assume that there is some process going to happen out there, and presumably he's a little bit worried about that. I think he's trying to present a narrative of the last 10 or 12 years that gets him off the hook. He's anything an explanation for the carnage and chaos that exists in large parts of the Middle East that don't actually implicate him. I think that's one part of it. I think the other thing is, as people have suggested, I think incredibly there is in the kind of transatlantic establishment still a strong strand of neoconservatism that has influence in the corridors of power, and he is one of their prime spokespeople and representatives. But I think he may have perhaps overstepped the mark a bit here, because he's kind of divested himself of the democratic veneer that very often accompanies a lot of this rhetoric, and so he's very open about the project, you know, backing the coup in Egypt, supporting the opposition in Syria, which is kind of crazily contradictory to the main message of being against Islamism. All these things are probably not helpful for the neocons, so I suspect they have a love-hate relationship with him.
Mm. Dr. Tamimi, do you think that one thing that perhaps we should be mindful of is the kind of Obama administration's tenure is coming towards an end? It's hard to see another American president, Democrat and certainly not Republican, that might be so risk averse or so affected by the kind of Iraq syndrome as Obama is, and that the words from Blair which seem out of kilter will be much more in fashion again then? Is that one danger, do you think?
That's possible, although I don't think that Obama has improved things, not even an atom. A lot of rhetoric which made him look better than George Bush at times, especially for those of us who opposed the war on Iraq and before that on Afghanistan. But actually Obama continued what Bush did or started, using different tools and different techniques. I mean, would it not make you feel rather strange that so far the Obama administration has not acknowledged that what happened in Egypt on the 3rd of July is not a coup? Same would apply to Cameron, of course, here in the United Kingdom, unfortunately, and that's what enabled the coup perpetrators in Egypt to proceed with the massacres, with the sentencing of the cream of Egyptians to death, as we've seen before and as we've seen earlier today. So I'm not sure that Obama is really any better for anyone who advocates justice and freedom around the world.
Chris, I mean, I guess, taking Dr. Mew's point, that there's perhaps much less of substance has changed, but some of the tools have changed, and some of the rhetoric has certainly changed. Can you see conditions under which the kind of, sort of high tide of neoconservative thought that we saw under George W. Bush would make a return to prominence in the States?
Certainly it could. The neoconservative trend is very strong. But I think the substance has changed. I agree that not necessarily better for the Middle East, but you see a very pragmatic Obama administration. So I don't think Obama wants to get trapped in the Middle East. I don't think he wants to send forces there. You can see it being explained by a highly realist trend in American foreign policy, which doesn't mean it's motivated by promotion of democracy or law or human rights. And that obviously is very different to a neocon interventionist approach to foreign policy. And it is in tune with American public opinion, and what you saw with the whole debate last August and September in America about intervention in Syria is very clearly that in the United States, and indeed here in Europe, there was no mood for an intervention after Iraq, after Afghanistan, and all the costs of that. And he is in tune with that. And that is perhaps the biggest break that any president will face in the coming years, that it's very difficult to go to war, to prosecute a war without the support of your population. It's an extremely politically risky move. Remember, when Bush went into Iraq, in the United States, he had a lot of support. Now, that went away, it wasn't successful and so forth, but at the start, he did have that sort of support. So it could make a return, but I think it would be much, much harder. Now, where I disagree with Tony Blair, I think that the United States and Russia and these countries do take the issue of Islamic extremism very seriously. They are actively engaged in doing things, drone strikes and the likes. It's not like they've taken their eye off the ball and they think it's not there. No, they are dealing with it. Now, we can debate whether it's effective or not and necessary, the human rights standards that have been abused in it. But I don't think it's been forgotten or people are pretending it's not there. I think if you look at what Obama has done, for example, the assault in Somalia, what's going on in Yemen and Africa, their primary focus is on this, but they're not going to get dragged into local disputes. And I think that partially explains Egypt. It's a sort of, really don't want to get involved. I want to do other things.
Chris, I mean, one of the hallmarks of that entire speech was really that we've got to get back to this intervention business. I mean, time and time again, it was kind of, you'll be sorry you didn't bomb Syria. That was a mistake. Advocacy of more NATO involvement in Libya. He says Libya's a mess, and the way to sort out the mess is if NATO gets back more involved. So, I mean, the whole tenure here of the debate is not just the justification of the past. It's an advocacy of this in the future, isn't it?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. I mean, one of the central absurdities of the speech is, of course, that actually Blair's policy itself did more than almost anything to create the very problems he talks about. So, we need to put that out there as well. But I think you're right, and I think this must indicate that while clearly the neocons are not in the ascendancy at the moment, there are possibilities of a return or some sort of hybrid policy which can amount to pretty much the same thing. It seems to me there are two things that could lead back into that kind of disastrous direction. One is the situation in Ukraine and the growing standoff with Russia, which I suspect may be one of the sort of background noises to this speech as well, because that does bring on board, more of a kind of warlike stance from Washington, even against Obama's people's best instincts, perhaps. That's one thing. The other thing is, of course, we do have an election coming up in the US. The Democrats are not looking particularly clever. Who knows what kind of regime we're going to have in place after an election. So I think for those reasons, Blair doesn't feel as high and dry as he really should do. The fact of the matter is the British people completely overwhelmingly reject the kind of policies he's putting forward here. The people in America do as well, and of course in the Middle East and large parts of the rest of the globe. But the fact of the matter is, inside the establishment, I don't think, unfortunately, it's game over for Blairism yet.
Dr. Mewey, do you think Blair has any receptive audience inside the Middle East itself? I mean, perhaps among the Israelis, perhaps among the Saudis. Do you think it travels any distance at all, a speech like that, or is it simply for Washington and London consumption?
His speech attracted some response in the Arab media and in the various discussions. What he said actually echoed exactly what the leaders of the coup in Egypt say, or what the Saudis and the Emiratis say, and similar dictators. For instance, take the example. He's trying to teach us what is good Islam and what is bad Islam. If there is such a thing as a good Islam, well, I'd love to see him, Tony Blair, embrace it for his own good. This language of that there are people who are distorting the image of Islam, and now Tony Blair wants to tell us what the true, the good and nice and acceptable image of Islam. This is exactly what the Saudis have been saying, the Emiratis, the Mubarak regime, and the current leaders who are an extension of the Mubarak era in Egypt as well. And people don't think that Tony Blair has much influence in Britain. Yet, because he made this speech, and it was a public speech, and by the way, the text was propagated through the websites, and news agencies received copies of it, made people think that there must be something behind this. There must be somebody, some authority, who are using Tony Blair. Yes, it's true he believes in what he says. I don't dispute that. But why now, and why in this manner? And some of the Arab commentators tried to link this to Cameron's decision to investigate the Muslim Brotherhood. I'm not so sure whether there is a link, but this was part of the discussion in the media.
Well, certainly, I mean, he made the link with the Brotherhood explicitly, and his case was one of those moments where it kind of departed from any democratic framework, because he said, okay, people say these guys aren't in favour of political terrorism, but so what? You know, they're propagating an ideology which could lead to this, so we've got to treat them almost the same. I mean, that was another sort of astonishing moment in it, wasn't it, for anybody who's used to the other prevailing or the previously prevailing model, where you were supposed to frame this argument at least in democratic clothes.
Well, I think this is more typical of some of the speeches in his past, where he has managed to sort of oversimplify politics in the Middle East, us and them equations, and so, you know, who are these Islamist extremists, and know exactly how you define them, and so we're going to chuck in everything from Al-Qaeda, ISIS and Muslim Brotherhood all into the same sort of pot and so forth, and these are all the evil bad guys.
In Xinjiang province in China, that got lumped in here as well.
It's, you know, and I think, you know, many commentators said it's just overly simplistic. And, you know, I think it was exactly the same, you know, you're either with us or against us in the post-9/11 era. So this sort of presenting the world in that sort of framework is very typical of Tony Blair. But it's easy to sort of slag him off and do him down. But it does point to something that needs to have a really strenuous debate, and that is that there is, you know, a crisis in many of these areas. You know, in some ways, some of what he depicted as a problem is true. His solutions are absolutely lousy and unworkable and not in any way democratic or just. But we do have, you know, a challenge to face. And I'm not sure that solutions are being put forward by anyone, certainly not by Blair. And so maybe we don't like the messenger, but at least in terms of the challenge that is out there, in terms of all these countries, is one that we still are struggling to find the proper solutions. Debates about intervention or non-intervention, debates about how you deal with regimes that are, you know, far from democratic. I mean, they exist. We can't decide to overthrow every single non-democratic perfect regime, and democratic countries also misbehave. So all of this is, you know, very much a subject I think that diplomats and policymakers are still struggling with. But I just don't think we really want to be listening to Tony Blair. And, you know, when is he going to move on to stop lecturing us about the Middle East right now? I mean,
well, it was quite interesting that actually he would raise what most people would be considered to be the serious questions here, but only to dismiss them. So he would say, well, people raised the question of economic deprivation, but that's not the explanation. People raised the question that there are all sorts of particular political aspects in each of these countries, but that's not the question. And then we would suddenly get back, you know, I mean, it was almost like the inverse of Alistair Campbell's advice not to do God. But in the end, it all came back to religion and its misinterpretation. I mean, there's kind of no way out of a frame like that, really, is there, Chris?
Well, that's the thing. It's the way that he framed it. I mean, he may have raised or pointed to genuine problems in a way, but his framing is so kind of powerful that it leads us completely in the opposite direction to any kind of solution. In fact, it reminded me in an odd way of Samuel Huntington's, Clash of Civilizations rhetoric, which was even cruder than what we had immediately after 9/11. Actually, it's going back to the early 90s. And one thing that I think needs to be pointed out here is that, as foreign policy prescription, this is insane and deeply damaging, but it's also dangerous domestically because he is playing into what appears to be a growing a kind of resurgence of Islamophobic rhetoric coming from actually the British establishment at the moment. We've seen the Cameron offensive against the Muslim Brotherhood. We've seen the fuss about nothing in the Birmingham schools. We've seen the victimisation of Mozambique and a number of other, and Jack Straw's recent speech about Christian values. So I think that's another extremely unhelpful dimension to this speech that I think needs to be taken up. And that marriage between Islamophobia and the kind of foreign policy is one that, I really think we have to work very hard to break in this country.
Well, we'll stop the conversation for this part of the programme right there because it's time for a break. But we will be coming back to precisely that issue, the influence of this kind of rhetoric on domestic politics in Britain, right after the break. Do rejoin us.